And let's see if we can't finish Fire on the Mountain from the Golden Harp from the Grey King. Will saw a fox run up the crag. Bran thought that it was his dog, so Bran ran after it. Will followed. But after getting stuck there, they realized that they were on Bird Rock. But the wind is coming from the north, and Bran has something to say about that, which we were cut off on in the last video, so we'll pick up from there. The white-haired boy said bleakly, "It's swinging to the north. That is the worst wind of all, the north wind. Gwent, tread, Ymiru, they call it, the wind that blows round the feet of the dead. It brings storms, and worse sometimes." The distant crackling of the fire seemed louder now. Will glanced over his shoulder down the hill. The smoke was thicker there, and he felt more heat in the air. The wind whirled in gusts, catching up cinders and soot from below into strange dark eddies round their heads. All at once Will knew with dreadful certainty that the Grey King was aware of him, precisely aware, gathering his power for attack, and that it was at that first moment of awareness that the fire on the mountain had begun. He flinched in a sudden sense of fearful loneliness. An old one, alone without others of the light, was vulnerable to the dark at its strongest, though he could not be destroyed for all time, yet he could be disarmed. The full power of a Lord of the Dark could, if it struck him defenseless, blast him out of time for so great a space that he could be of no help to his fellows until too late. So the Grey King struck now at will with fire, and with all else that might be at his command. And Bran was more vulnerable yet. Will swung back quickly. "Bran, come on, along the ridge to the top before the fire." His voice died in his throat, silently on the ridge round them. Out of the holes and crevices, round corners and crags, came slinking the grey-white, ghostly shapes of the Milgwen. More than a score of them, heads held low, teeth grinning, a white tip glinting on each stiffly held grey bushy tail. Their foxy smell was in the air, stronger than the smoke. At their head stood the king fox, their leader, red tongue lolling from a mouth set in a wide, dreadful grin, its white teeth long as fingers and sharp as nails, icicles of bone. The eyes were bright, the ruff stood out white round the huge shoulders and neck. Will clenched his fists, shouting angry words of power in the old speech, but the great grey fox did not flinch. Instead, it made a sudden sharp leap into the air, straight up on the one spot, as Will had seen a fox do in a Buckinghamshire field, far away from this valley to discover what danger lurked in a field of wheat higher than its head. As it jumped, the king fox gave one short, sharp bark, deep and clear. The Milgwen snarled low, and an abrupt woof of flame shot up at Will's side with a sound like a tearing cloth, as the fire on the mountain burst at last on the ridge of Craig Yaadrin, and roared, crackling round them in the bracken. Will shrank back. There was no way of escape but past the king fox, and the big fox crouched motionless, low on its belly, tensing itself to spring. There was a sudden piercing yell at Will's shoulder. Bran leapt forward, waving in his hand a crooked branch of scrub oak blazing like a tinder, a sheaf of flame. He thrust it full into the grey fox's face. Screaming, the animal fell back against its fellows, and the foxes milled in confusion. Before the branch could burn down to his arm, Bran flung it aside. Unexpectedly, caught by a gust of wind, it fell over the opposite side of the ridge, down toward the unburned slope. Out it went, and over the edge, and down to the far side of the crag, where the fire might not otherwise have gone. There was a gasp of flame as the fire took hold on its new prey. Bran wailed in horror. "Will, I've been sent down to Pritchard's farm. We're cut off both ways." "The top!" Will called urgently. "We must get to the top!" With all the certainty of ancient instincts, he knew the place they must find. It had begun compellingly to call him, unseen, waking to his quest. He knew what it would look like. He knew what he must do when they reached it. But the reaching was another matter. Flames crackled at either side of them, scorching their skin dry. Ahead, The Milgwen gathered, now in a tight semicircle, waiting. Desperately, Will put protection about himself and Bran, standing foursquare, facing the north, and calling some words in the old speech. It was the spell of Heled, to give freedom to a wanderer against any compulsion by those holding the land over which he roamed. But there was not much hope in him. He knew he could not hold for long. Beside him he heard Bran give a great, imploring shout, like a small child calling for help without knowing that he calls. "Careful! Careful!" And out of nowhere, along the ridge toward them, came a white streak, leaping at the nearest fox, charging it sideways, so that it spun round with a shriek, rolling over and over. The tight semicircle wavered, uncertain. Cathal leapt, snarling at the next fox, his jaws closing quick and hard on its shoulder. And the animal squealed dreadfully and twisted away. There, in the rent he had torn in the rank of the Milgwen, the white dog stood, belligerent as a bull, with his legs planted firm on the rock, and the message, glinting in his strange silver eyes, was clear. Will grabbed Bran by the arm and slipped out with him past Cathal, free while the panting foxes hesitated. "Up here, Bran! Quick, it's the only place!" Bran's eyes flickered over the black earth and white fur, dark hills and grey sky. He saw the great king fox of the Milgwen, watching them, controlled again, poised for pursuit. Then Cathal, curving to face the animal, began a long crescendo snarl, more blood-curdling than any sound Bran had ever heard in his life. In fulfillment of some long destiny, the dog was making it possible for them to escape. There was no excuse not to obey. With a sudden flooding of trust and humility, Bran turned and scrambled upward after Will. Clambering on hands and feet over the rocky ridge, Will made for the place to which they must go. It sang to him, beckoning. Below, the rocks to which they clung, smoke swirled like a dark sea. High above, unseen birds screamed and cawed in angry fear. When he could climb no further, Will saw a narrow overhang, cleft in the rocks just before him. A long slit broadened and eroded by frost and wind and rain. Its grey granite sides were green-patched with lichen. Irresistibly it summoned him. He called to Bran, "In here!" And his voice rose louder, commanding, "Careful!" The granite sides of the cliff towered 3 times higher than his head. Entering, Will glanced back over his shoulder. He saw Bran following, bemused. And then a quick white shape sliding after him, as Cathal darted forward, nuzzling his nose briefly into Bran's hand as he passed. Outside on the rock, a shrieking tumult of baffled rage rose from the furious Milgwen, prevented from entry. Their master's power, Will now knew, was a power over the rock and the mountains and all the high places of Gwynedd, but only over those. Inside the rock and the mountain was a different domain. He went on. At its far end, a rocky cleft widened a little. The light was dim. Things seemed indistinct, as if in a dream. Outside, the foxes barked and screamed, and then there was nothing more ahead of Will but bare grey rock, a formidable blank wall ending the cleft. Will stared at the rock, and his mind filled with a warmth of discovery and relief as intense as joy. The dog, Cathal, was at his side, standing straight and proud as a young horse. Will dropped one hand to rest on the white head. The other arm he raised before him with fingers stiff outstretched in a gesture of command, and he called out 3 words in the old speech. And before him the rock parted like a great gate to a faint, very faint sound of delicate music that was achingly familiar and yet strange, gone as soon as it was heard. Will walked forward through the rocky doors with Cathal trotting confidently beside him, head high and tail waving, and Bran, a little hesitantly, followed them. And that's the end of Fire on the Mountain.